Welcome back, folks, to the Dispatch Podcast. It is Joseph, and this week, joining me for this episode is historian and CEO of the Battle of Franklin Trust, Eric Jacobson, and we are going to be discussing the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858 for the Illinois Senate race of that year, and sort of their legacy and why they are so important to understanding the greater context of how the American Civil War is viewed. How do they influence some of the interpretation that we've included here at all three historic sites, and how are they remembered as part of the legacy in American politics? So, Eric, welcome back to the Dispatch.
Hello, hello.
And we should just dive right in. We've only got 30 minutes, so we will do a crash course. So how do the Lincoln-Douglas debates fit into that sort of decade in which America loses its head?
There's a reason that the Lincoln-Douglas debates are remembered all these years later. Unlike anything else, I don't know that anybody remembers the Kennedy-Nixon debates. Well, maybe one of those, but there's no real political discussion or rhetoric quite like what Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas engage in that fall of 1858. And it was because the country was careening off the rails, and these two men really embodied the greatest of divisions. You had the emerging Republican Party, and it was being viewed as a real threat. It was a sort of reorganization of Northern politics, but the Republicans had become a decided threat. This is only 2 years after the Republicans had run their first candidate for president, a full-blown abolitionist, and here comes Lincoln, who's more of a moderate. And Douglas, of course, has been carrying the water for Democrats for a long time, but you're beginning to see the split in the Democrat Party between these Northern Democrats, which Douglas represented, and Southern Democrats, who'd eventually really begin to define the secession push a couple of years later. So, I don't think it's one thing. I mean, obviously the topics that Lincoln and Douglas engage in are the things that made them such powerful events at the time. It's not like the debates became popular afterwards. These were debates attended by thousands and thousands of people. But it's really what's at stake. The Lincoln-Douglas debates are the seminal moments in American history because it's right before the crisis just envelops the entire country.
And the topics that they're discussing range in everything from slavery to how we should view the Declaration of Independence. These two are leading almost divergent paths for the nation. One will maintain the idea of the founding. The other will attempt to redefine it, I think is probably the best way to explain it. And they get started with the first debate in Ottawa, and that is in August of 58. And by the end of the Ottawa debate, it is almost apparent that Lincoln, lawyer that he is, needs that moment or two to sort of collect his thoughts rather than have to respond to a string of allegations with deny, 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 deny. This debate is not, and we won't do a play-by-play of how each debate goes, but by the time that this debate ends, it is clear that the orator of that debate is Lincoln. And these two kind of figureheads of these parties are going back and forth nonstop for months. And it almost seems as though we should talk about this as if Lincoln won the debates, but he doesn't. He does not win the Senate election. So how do they, despite his defeat, how do they have any effect on what we think of Lincoln from 58 to 60? How does that have any influence if at the end of it Douglas wins the election for the 58 Senate race anyways?
I think actually in the long run, Lincoln did win the debate. He just lost the election. And there's a difference because there are two things going on. This is a conversation between the two of them, which is about a more localized election. Mm-hmm. It's U.S. Senate, but it's U.S. Senate for a state, Illinois, in the north. So they're having a conversation with one another in front of mostly white Northerners. Mm-hmm. And it is about the Declaration. It is about race, which is, the white race being superior to the black race, mm-hmm. who are almost exclusively enslaved. But see, Lincoln, I think, wins the debate in the long run because this is a national conversation.
Mm-hmm.
It just happens to be going on in Illinois, and Douglas is, Douglas is he's a good speaker, but he's also a consummate politician, and he's always looking for this opportunity to play a zero-sum game. And he's doing it with race, and he does it. I mean, race is the thing that Douglas keeps going back to over and over and over and over again. And of course, he's pandering to many white people in the audience who have all sorts of, racial prejudices. Today we'd call them outright racists. Well, Lincoln's trying to navigate a minefield, and it takes Lincoln a while, I think, really to. Lincoln had been he'd given a number of speeches before this, and he had been quite articulate in his position, but he doesn't do well the first few times Douglas smacks him around. And Lincoln has to figure out, how does he make an argument, a case, through a debate where he's not really even talking to the audience. I think Abraham Lincoln understood far better than Stephen Douglas. Lincoln was speaking to a national audience.
Because this is a debate that, while the people reading it in, say, New Orleans don't care about roads that could be built or railroads that could go in Illinois, they're paying attention to the larger conversation that's being had about race and about slavery that is going on between, essentially, the representative faces of the parties, the Republican and the Democrats. And Stephen Douglas, despite being a Northern Democrat, would have favored the idea, and he actually authors the idea of popular sovereignty. And in one of the debates, and it's the early portions of the debates, in the first phase, he says he does not care whether slavery be voted up or be voted down in the territories. And that takes it to a discussion of this idea of going back to the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act. And that is where we can see the nation having to grapple with the expansion of the institution of slavery further west.
Which is really an interesting point, because he does care about whether slavery gets voted up or down, because he's a Democrat. He's totally in bed with slavery. So he's not taking any stance against it. He's actually opening up the doors for it to expand. He's being the worst kind of politician. He's the architect of the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act, which really is the thing that, to be quite plain, really pisses Lincoln off, because he sees this as an overturn of 20-plus years of a compromise about where slavery could go. I think Douglas is totally in bed with the pro-slavery movement. He just artfully says, well, I'm okay with whether of course he's okay with it, but he's opened up the doors for slavery to go into places where it had been restricted for quite some time.
And if you're a Republican, you hear that one way, and if you're a Southern Democrat, you hear it a completely different way.
Sure.
Or a Democrat at all at that point. But the real crux that they will square, and they square off multiple times, and we think of presidential debates now, or Senate races and debates now, these local debates, they maybe 1 or 2, and then it's election day, 3 or 4 for a larger election. But these guys are through, and as historian Alan Gelso puts it, through multiple phases of both of their campaigns, they collide multiple times.
And they're also giving speeches individually between the debates
on their own campaign stumping, and then that is these phases that Gelso alludes to, and it almost seems like it ramps up and ramps up and ramps up every single time, and the issues become almost more divisive, and you start to see more signs that show up at these Lincoln-Douglas debates, as S.A. Douglas and popular sovereignty, or Lincoln and the Republic, and all of these things. It just continues to grow to what we almost can kind of see these debates now in our own elections and in our recent memory. So
Lincoln seems to really light on fire in September.
Yeah.
There's a speech he gives in Edwardsville, in Illinois, on September 11th, 1858, where he throws a match right in the gasoline, and it's the first time that I've ever been aware of how Lincoln attacks the issue of not just slavery but of race and what's really at stake. And I've said many times it's one of the few moments when you see Lincoln speaking like an evangelical Christian, which he was not. but he addresses the issue of God. He addresses the issue of damnation and of hell, and that this is what slaves, this is what people were being treated like, that it's like they'd been cast into hell, and he's questioning, if you continue this, I think that the line is, don't be surprised when the demon you have aroused turns and rends you. It's a powerful moment where Lincoln's already changing, which he was always very good at. He's malleable. Some people would see that as just being political. I think it's actually the opposite. I think he sees the growing threat. Douglas can't change. Douglas just keeps saying the same thing over and over and over and over again. And Lincoln starts to change the argument.
He had staked his whole political career on Kansas, Nebraska, and on its success.
Right.
And I think that's even one of the things that Lincoln had brought up, is that he had chained his entire life to it.
What's really missing from the debates is we can't hear their tone of voice.
To pick up the subtle sarcasm.
I think sometimes Lincoln wasn't subtly sarcastic. He was. I mean, he comes right out and just that's when he's playing to the audience, because he's pointing out the inconsistencies. He's pointing out some of the frankly nonsensical nature of what Douglas is arguing. Like when he backs Douglas into a corner and gets him to admit that the Declaration, in Douglas's opinion, only applied to white Europeans. Well, Lincoln then just uses that like a weapon against Douglas. Douglas is trying to get him. Douglas is playing that, I said earlier, zero-sum game. He's playing all the dirty racial components, like race mixing. He calls it, I think, amalgamation. And he's trying to pin Lincoln down. And Lincoln finally says, "Well, I don't need to own a Negro, and I don't need to marry one. I can just leave him alone." But Douglas does this repeatedly through the debates. He even tries to get Lincoln on the issue of equality, which Lincoln admits he's not at all of the belief that a black man or a black person is equal to white people. But he also then goes right on to say that slavery is wrong, and that earlier part, the former part where he addresses the issue of inequality, or that black people are not equal to whites, that is something that there's a modern group of people who they use that against Lincoln all the time, but what they conveniently leave out is everything else he said.
Yeah, and that it was less a debate about common law and equality as it was to natural law and equality.
And they also leave out the fact that Lincoln was saying the Declaration of Independence meant exactly what it said. All men are created equal, not all white Europeans are created equal. And that period of time was in 1858. See, Lincoln had been developing this idea, or had settled on this idea about the Declaration years before, because he was writing his friend Joshua Speed as early as 1855 about, if we keep going down this course, it'll just be, little groups, and pretty soon it'll be, foreigners won't be included in Catholics. And he actually makes a comment about, if that's the case, I'd just rather move to Russia.
Yeah, where you can take the cold despotism pure without the base
alloy of hypocrisy, right?
So I think that there's a description in the book that we'll pitch towards the end as Lincoln and Douglas, the debates that defined American politics. But there's a description that Gelso uses where it says that it is more Goliath, as David and Goliath, of course, being the comparison between Douglas, this kind of, and it's also important to think of these guys' physical attributes as well, because that's how we remember
So the little guy is Goliath in this analogy?
Exactly.
Is that right? Right.
And it's the exact opposite in mind, but we also think of 1960 and the Kennedy and Nixon debates is the first time that you're able to see them physical appearances wear on you as well. In 1858, it's this small, squatty, kind of heavy set, a very abrasive politician in Douglas.
Like the Penguin from Batman.
Exactly, like the Penguin from Batman.
Right.
And then Lincoln, who is the tall, kind of lanky, very simple spoken person, and yet both of them has this ability to take the point that just sees onto one thing that the other says, and they can run for an hour and a half with it. And it's I think it's what's most remarkable about this series of debates is that after the opening responses, it is almost all impromptu.
You know what's also not covered in the debates? What's interesting, I was just thinking about that. I think this is where the hatred of Lincoln and the fear of Lincoln really does begin.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I said I think he wins the debates. He says everything that absolutely terrifies a segment of the population. Not just people in the South, but people in the North.
Mm-hmm.
because there were plenty of Democrats in the North. And it begins right there. And it's why I think there are people who really despise Lincoln to this day. He was saying all the things some people just didn't want to hear.
And he stuck to it. Whereas Douglas could kind of back his way out of it, or would willingly back his way out of it, or position himself to be able to back his way out of it.
And you know what he never says? He never says tariffs.
Or taxes.
He never says taxes.
Yeah.
He doesn't. It's about race. It's about slavery. It's about the Declaration of Independence.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and he keeps pounding away. And once he gets his footing, it's like a heavyweight boxing match. You know, he gets knocked around the first couple rounds, but once he gets his feet underneath him, I think Douglas at some point probably had to realize he was in a fight for his life. And actually, Lincoln, even though he loses that Senate election, you know, he actually got more votes. But the way the congressional districts were organized, ironically, it would be like the 1860 election, where the guy who got the fewest votes actually won the election, which is what happens with Douglas.
And so I think that the debates are important, but what's an interesting concept or an aspect of the story is that the debates are over. Douglas wins the election. And then in 1860, when these two men square off again for the presidency in 1860 against Breckinridge and John Bell, after Lincoln is elected, there becomes no greater fan of Abraham Lincoln than Stephen Douglas, especially right in the midst of the secession crisis.
Or he's an equal opponent of secession.
Maybe he doesn't ever ally with him.
Right.
So much as it becomes this, we've got to turn the cart back around. We have to get back on the rails.
Douglas found out that the party that he represented wasn't interested in his position. They were interested in secession. That's why they abandoned him. It's why they eventually had Breckinridge running as the Southern Democrat, because Douglas somehow wasn't in enough with the crowd, even though he'd been the guy for the better part of a decade.
He had sold out just about every single thing that he could have sold out, which is always the comparison made to the secession movement by itself. Is one of those common sort of blurbs that gets thrown at us is, well, if the North or the Union would have compromised, well, there was nothing left to compromise. Stephen Douglas couldn't have compromised any more on his position than he already had, and so Breckinridge comes to the fore, and Breckinridge becomes the Southern Democrats guy, and then secession follows shortly after Lincoln's election. And there's that period, as we are looking at Lincoln and his party throughout that crisis, is that there is no other place. There's nothing left to have compromise. Everything is gone from 50 to 60 at that point.
Yeah, Lincoln was, even though he loses, the Republican Party had staked its position on a couple of very, very simple things. Mm-hmm. And so when Lincoln wins and he's being sworn in, people can deny this. He offers the final compromise, which is simply stay in the Union. And it'll be essentially the status quo. Republicans are going to fight against expansion, but you can have slavery where it exists. Mm-hmm. Stephen Douglas found out at that very moment the thing that he had been trying to protect, the thing that he had lobbied for, that he'd politicked for, that he'd spoken for, that he had invested thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of his life. It wasn't good enough. And they were going to tear the country apart. And, I can't say enough, Lincoln had emerged as the greatest threat that the Southern political establishment ever saw. Because you could marginalize the abolitionists, and here comes the guy just saying that the Union must be preserved and we're going to try and contain slavery. We're not going to end it right away. Mm-hmm.
A very moderate position.
A very moderate position for 1858, 59, or 60. But when the radicals won't accept moderation, then you have a problem. Mm-hmm. Because, well, that's what makes them radicals. And in the end, it was a subset of one party. It wasn't even the entire Democrat Party. It was just a subset of the party. I just was talking to someone earlier today that there's a population of 30 million people. Lincoln knows what the demographics are. There's 30 million people in the country, and 20 plus million of them live in the North. Well, half of the people who lived in the South were slaves, and So how many people were really driving this entire movement towards secession? A minority.
Mhm.
And I don't think Stephen Douglas, as a Northern Democrat, understood the incredible radicalism that had infected part of the white South. But do you know the other thing that Lincoln is doing in the 1858 debates? He's challenging Northerners because he sees the racial apathy of the North.
Mm-hmm.
And he is concerned that what is happening in the South is going to sweep into the North. And then the entire country is just doomed. Because if slavery becomes the focus of everything, then this representative government will likely just fall apart, because then the Declaration means nothing, and thus the Constitution can be just bastardized and bent sideways and turned into whatever it wants to, and the states can do whatever they want to. So, as he said in 1861, it's anarchy.
Mm-hmm.
It's just anarchy when the minority gets control and decides they're going to do whatever they want with whatever they want whenever they want.
Right. And he revisits that point in the debate, saying that, I don't believe that this union would ever dissolve. It would either become all one thing or all the other.
Yep.
I think that in order for us to understand the beginning of the war, to understand secession, I think we have to look back to the Lincoln-Douglas debate. So I think this is a good way to end this episode. But what we'll also be doing is, over the course of this summer, we're going to be recording with various members of the staff here, historical interpreters, curatorial staff, you name it. Everyone will at some point have come through here and read a portion of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and that will be available to actually listen to these debates and understand them a little bit more. Eric, thank you for joining us on the Dispatch. As usual, we would like to promote one of the books that we sell here in the Battle of Franklin Trust bookstores. You can check out Alan Gelzo's Lincoln and Douglas, The Debates That Defined America. It is an in-depth study of the language of the debates as well as the politics of both men. It's a sort of dual biography for the first couple of chapters, and then after really takes off into a study of the debates and the sort of the controversies and the speeches delivered by both, and the reactions to Lincoln's oration and to Douglas's oration, both nationally and among the people just sitting right there, those thousands of people crowded there to listen to them. And as Gelzo points out, this is the first debate that the entire nation is really paying attention to, and it really sets the stage for political debates going forward. So an incredible book to pick up. Check it out at boft.org/shop, and it'll bring you right. Thanks for listening at home or in the car, wherever you are finding the Dispatch. Be sure to leave us a review, like, and subscribe to the podcast. And until then, we'll see you on the battlefields.